Thank you very much indeed for this delightful, very, very gracious and kind opportunity. I am humbled by the invitation to address you on such an important occasion. I wish to pay my respect to the Mary Ward family and to on this especially auspicious occasion, 20 years in serving at the UN, with the UN, within the UN, is definitely a significant milestone. And I am very honored and privileged to have this moment to, for lack of a better word, converse with you on some of the issues related to being faith-based, faith-inspired, and serving at the United Nations as this incredible IBVMCJ NGO does. So thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be able to think aloud with you. I have worked on the intersection of religion, religious institutions, religious NGOs, religious leaders, and human rights and good governance for almost 40 years now, as a student, as a teacher, and as an activist. I am going to share some very, shall we say, thought-provoking thoughts with you, not because I aim to provoke per se, but also because I think we're at the things that are happening around us in the world now demand that we are perhaps even more courageous and even more self-reflexive than all of us have been for a long time. And I think it's important to, as we come together in this space, in the different spaces of encounter, it is important for us to enable and allow one another that space to be somewhat constructively critical, as we acknowledge the remarkable input and contributions that faith-based and faith-inspired people of peace like yourselves and the entire Mary Ward family and so many non-governmental organizations who work with the UN are. If ever there was a moment in our history in which we are called upon to come together in determined thoughts and actions for peace and about peace, it is this moment now.
Este es el momento.
One of the things that I'm hearing my own translation in Spanish, which is really interesting, but just letting you know. One of the things that I want to share with you now is just something that you know already, but so as we can set the parameters for the due recognition and celebration that the Mary Ward family and other inspired, faith-inspired organizations need to always find and receive, that due recognition and celebration of tireless and remarkable efforts and continuing commitments to peace. Because I have worked with secular non-governmental organizations and other secular intergovernmental settings and networks, as well as with faith-based and faith-inspired, I'm going to share three distinctive features of faith-based and faith-inspired activism in issues of peacemaking, which includes upholding human rights and sustainable development efforts. As you well know, the sustainable development efforts are everything practically that is needed and gets done, whether it's on poverty, employment, environment, gender equality, everything that lives around us that is related to human development. So what are the three distinctive features about faith-based, faith-inspired, and, for lack of a better word, secular, more secular values, which, by the way, all values are derived from faiths. So, but let's, for the sake of our incredibly westernized secular hemisphere, think that secular is somehow a different set of values. But what are some of the distinctive features about those who maintain and uphold the faith-based identity as they undertake incredibly valuable work in international development, human rights, and peace and security? One particular distinction is that as these faith-based and faith-inspired actors serve, they actually refer to their work as service, as opposed to I'm working in, but most faith-based and faith-inspired actors refer to what they do as a service, most especially women, faith-based and faith-inspired like yourselves. What you may notice is that as you speak of your work, as you relate it and relate to it, you will be talking of service, and you won't shy away of talking about service. It'll be somewhat rarer to find the more secular inspired actors speaking about their service. Another interesting and distinctive feature is that faith-based and faith-inspired activism in general has tended to be, I'm using those verbs deliberately, volunteer and voluntary. There are very few, of course, there are some, but on the spectrum of the whole of the faith-based and faith-inspired actions, there are very few that are actually based on getting paid and paid significant amounts of money. Whereas if you take a peek at the relatively more secular spaces, the aspect of monetary value and recognition of work done is much more significant. In other words, there will be a tendency, and again, there will be a tendency, there has been a tendency in the faith-based and faith-inspired world to serve voluntarily, to give of one's time and effort and thoughts and whatever resources on a volunteer basis. And this is a very distinctive aspect, or has been a very distinctive aspect of faith-based service. The third, by the way, there are many, but I'm just choosing three prominent ones because I want to talk about how those then look and what they mean today. The third aspect of faith-based and faith-inspired service is that, quite frankly, it is truly universal, transnational. It knows no boundaries. It understands and recognizes, all of you understand and recognize different countries, geographies, races, genders. You get all that, you do all that, but you rarely ever confine yourself to only one geographical location of service, and you rarely ever confine yourself to only one area or aspect of human rights, peace and security and development. So actually, faith-based and faith-inspired activism and service tends to be multilateral in the sense that you work together for everything. And when you address any particular issue, you address and you serve with an understanding of the complexity of the whole. So even if you're doing and specializing, shall we say, in the domain of environment, that specialization in the domain of environment is not to the exclusion of issues of race and class and gender and poverty. On the contrary, it is a rather holistic understanding of what it is that needs to happen. And you approach it with that, how can we serve the whole of the set of issues, rather than how can we zero in on biodiversity and work on that alone, for instance. This compound or holistic approach to serving different domains is a very unique feature of faith-based and faith-inspired activism. I'll wager that this comes because the inspiration that is from faith rarely tends to be, well, I'm inspired by my faith to serve the environment at the exclusion of all else, because actually our faiths tell us that everything is interconnected because the same creator created all. So you can't just serve in one little part of things, no matter how grand that is, but actually it is in that holistic approach that the service is done. So a holistic approach, a usually tendency towards serving voluntarily, and an ability to look at the different intersections of issues together without necessarily focusing on only one. I think those are at least some of the distinctive qualities. There are many others. Why did I choose those specific three qualities? Because they impact a great deal on the way that our world is today. We live in a world in which by and large, it seems as if we have lost touch with the essential values that we need as human beings, whether they are enshrined in a Universal Declaration of Human Rights or whether they are derived from a holy book or a sacred narrative. There seems to be a significant distance from values and actions. Every faith tradition in the world, and I use that term deliberately, faith tradition, not just religion, every faith tradition in the world actually says pretty much the same thing about how interconnected our very existence is. It also, most faith traditions, if not all of them, tell us that we have to live in service to one another and to our environment. All faith traditions from the indigenous on instruct that awareness, that consciousness, if you will, of interdependency, and therefore the need to be deliberate in serving one another. But our contemporary norms and behaviors from governments to non-state actors of remarkably diverse hue are actually pointing to another standard entirely, which is more winner takes all, more weapons, more power, bigger is better, force and violence get things done. This is the era of force and violence, whereas all faith traditions actually preach cohesion, peacefulness, mindfulness, service. So we are living at a time of remarkably conflicting realities, the realities of the faith-based and faith-inspired, and the realities of how most seem to be operating today, which is winner takes all and might is right. Given this dynamic, the ethos of service, holistic, without regard for remuneration, is an incredibly precious set of realities. So you're celebrating 20 years at the UN, which is a significant milestone. And perhaps I would dare to say it hasn't been more important than it is right now. So 20 years after the service at the UN, with policymakers attempting to influence spaces, now is the time when you are needed most. The question is how to continue to serve in this space of the United Nations in a way that can enable you to do your fundamental mission of healing. Yours is a fundamental mission of healing. Spirit, soul, body, and environment. How to continue to serve in this context where might is right and values are valueless. You yourselves, based on your extensive experiences, know best how to serve your communities, how to do the work you've done and will continue to do best. So I am not supposing that I will be able to tell you anything you do not know. There is only one thing that I would like to advocate for that I think truly will make a difference given the current situation in our world. Of this might makes right, even at the expense of our long-term livelihoods and sustainability, let alone peace. Two things I would like to suggest are incredibly necessary and important. Again, based not on the fact that you already don't do a very fine job, you do a very, very fine job. Statistics, such as they are, tell us that even in the domain of primary healthcare, let alone education, sanitation, environment, peace building, let alone in all the, but just if we take the example of public health, which coming out of a pandemic is really not a bad example to see. But if we just take the example of public health, we know that faith-based organizations serve to the tune of at least 30 to 40% basic primary healthcare all over the world. The average rate of service that is faith-based and faith-inspired everywhere in the world is, say, 30%, which means that everywhere in the world, a quarter of public health services are actually run by and through religious organizations or religious institutions. That's a massive amount of service on the very basic levels of human existence, and the very basic levels of human needs, health. We don't have the data that tell us what that rate of service is when it comes to nutrition, education, and sanitation. An example I always share is that, I'm a Muslim, an Egyptian. When I went to school in Egypt, I went to school to a Catholic school. And like many around the world who come from different religious backgrounds, actually got schooled in Catholic schools. Why? Because they were and still are known to be amongst the best. So this is just a reality. They're there, they're present, and they're amongst the best. That is a global reality. What it tells us in terms of percentages of educational institutions that serve in the education sector, we don't have all the data about that yet. But I can tell you that it's awesomely clear to most people around the world that religious institutions were the original schools and education centers and libraries and spaces and centers of knowledge in most parts of the world, and they still are. So the truth is that when it comes to public service, when it comes to the work of development, actually religious institutions are at the forefront of serving communities. So I am not about to tell you how to do that. What I am going to challenge a little bit is the extent to which those service institutions, service mechanisms, those organizations like yours actually work collectively, actually serve together. In other words, how much of what areas of service that you excel in and deliver are actually done by other religious organizations, other religious institutions, not only from within your own faith, but actually multi-religiously. How many of these critical services that are being run in different countries around the world, how many of them are actually done together, so that it's not only the Christian, which heaven knows is big enough, it's not only the ecumenical, but it's actually the ecumenical plus the other religions. One of the findings from the COVID pandemic was that very few of these religious institutions and religious services were being coordinated with one another, not just ecumenically, but you would find in the same country where everybody was suffering the same issues and the same concerns, the same fears, the same diseases, the same symptoms, that every single faith-inspired service was being delivered in a silo. The Catholic communities and organizations were serving everyone, but they were serving as the Catholic community and organizations. The Muslim communities and organizations serving everyone, but serving as Muslim alone. Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, all serving all, but each serving on their own. The trick to balance a world that is inspired by might rather than by what is just, the trick to changing that balance is not only to continue to serve as we always have, but the trick is to build the bridges with one another based precisely on our beliefs and our abilities to serve all. We're halfway there. We're halfway there because every single one of these different faith-based and faith-inspired domains is actually serving everyone, right? So whether they're Catholic or Protestant of different hues, or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Sikh or what have you, they're all serving everyone. These services don't say, okay, if you're not of my religion, I'm not going, you can't come in, or I'm not going to serve you. On the contrary, they serve all. So we're halfway there. The other half, though, that is the tipping point for what we are called upon to do by our faiths. The other half that is the tipping point is to be able to serve together, to serve all, to do so together. And that's the only thing that will distinguish from otherwise run public health services, public schooling, public education, public whatever. The only thing that will distinguish and create a tipping point towards a genuine ability to coexist in spite of the challenges is that we can work and deliver together. Now, why is that so difficult? It's difficult for a number of reasons. It's hard to coordinate when you have so many different institutions and organizations anyway in one place. It's one of the most difficult things to do. But you know something? It's even harder to let things be and go as they are today. Because look at the result. Look at the result around us when you're serving selflessly for decades, for centuries. And look at the state of the world around us. Clearly, serving selflessly on our own isn't enough. The question is, how do we serve together better? Now imagine the scenarios that many of you probably know in your own individual lives, or perhaps in your organizational lives, where you have managed to come together across different religious belief systems and serve the same communities. Those of you who have those experiences know how incredibly empowering that is, not only in terms of being able to serve better and to serve more, but actually for your own sense of faithfulness. What is more amazing than being able to pray together, irrespective of what it is we're praying for and how it is that we're praying? What is more empowering on the route to encounter the divine than to be able to do so across our different faith traditions? Yet all of us acknowledge and bow to the divine. If we believe that we are all created from that same creator, then why do we think that it's only our way that acknowledges the truth of that creator? If indeed we are all created by the same creator, then it is incumbent upon us to collectively serve that creator. And perhaps it is in that collective service that we encounter the true face of our creator. Now, how does this work in a secular context? So the good news is that the awareness of faith-based and faith-inspired engagement, action, and services is now perhaps at an all-time high within these secular institutions. There are many who will still complain, quite rightly, that the average secular decision maker in a government or an intergovernmental setting like the United Nations or the European Union or the African Union or many such, there are those who will legitimately say they still don't see the value added of faith-inspired engagement. And that is true. There are still many who think that religion is a source of all trouble. And really, I really have no time for this. We've got to get our relatively more secular actors, institutions, and services running better. That faith-based can do whatever they want. They do it, in their own spaces, in their own time. That's all good. But really, we've got our own set of doing things, and that's a very secular modus operandi, and that's what we're interested in. Yes, there are still many who think that. The truth, however, is that over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years within the United Nations system itself, there is a greater awareness. there are many more partnerships being forged in country and at the regional level and at the global level with religious organizations and NGOs. Many more heads of religious NGOs are being invited to secular policy-making tables in intergovernmental fora by governments, etc. And that's just a reality. There are two challenges with that. And that's where the not so good news comes in. 99% of those who are convened around the policy table, when they are convened, when they are invited, when they're partnered with, are generally male-dominated institutions, and usually they're men sitting around the table. Now, faith-inspired and faith-based men are absolutely wonderful, no issue there. But the truth of the matter is that it's usually women who are doing a bulk of the service delivery, coordination, and organization in their respective communities. And their perspectives, their realities, their truths rarely ever make it to the policymaking table. That is being worked on by some of these organizations like yours, who are there as women-led, women-driven, women-run. But you'll find that the access and entry points still remain limited to male religious leaders and male-run entities and organizations. And there is an ever so subtle, shall we say, tendency to prefer the male-run establishments and the male leaders. Because you see, we talk a lot about how the secular values have unfolded and what they are. And the truth is that this reality that we live in, where effectively might makes right, that is not a woman-led or a women-driven or a women-inspired reality. That is a misogynistic reality. Secular, faith-based, and everything in between, women suffer that reality. And they are at a disadvantage in such a context in general. You would think that given this rising misogyny, women would come together more across their faith traditions, and even with no faith traditions, that they would simply coalesce more, to serve more, to serve better, to heal more. Unfortunately, we do not see those kinds of partnerships between faith-based and faith-inspired women and their secular counterparts committed to almost the same things, by the way. Instead, we see deep divisions forming on specific issues. And while these specific faith-driven issues are important and very significant for believers, it is important even more, I think, to remember that the ultimate objective of peaceful and social coexistence demands that we learn how to overcome our differences on specific issues and to nevertheless work together to serve the common good. Very often, multilateral spaces, in other words, spaces like the United Nations, where more than one partner there's more than one actor, very often multilateral spaces will not see the multi-religious spaces. They will assume that multilateral means secular, when in fact, multilateral also means multi-religious. But why would you expect a secular policymaker, or a whole bunch of them for that matter, to believe that multi-religious is multilateral? Why would you expect them to believe that when the multi-religious is really not that obvious? Where is the multi-religious set of partnerships and collaborations around the world that are contributing to the very basic needs of humanity? Where are they? The answer is they're not really very existent. Quite frankly, if they were, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in today in terms of war being seen as the most likely and most necessary option by most decision makers in most countries around the world. If we worked multi-religiously, we would be better inspired to serve all together. If we worked multi-religiously, war would never be an option. War is an option only of those who work in their own domains with their own belief systems, whether those belief systems are religious or faith or secular. War is not an option that those inspired by their faiths working together would ever choose for. And war is not an option for the women who are serving selflessly, tirelessly on a volunteer basis, all their communities together. It is not an option women would make or take. Yes, women do get involved in secular policy-making stages, and they do make war. There is a legacy and history of that too. We're not saying women are angels. What I am saying is that women inspired by their faith, working together across their faiths in serving their communities, are 99.9% unlikely to ever wage war against each other. And that's a truth because there's not a single example in history which we can use to counter that. When and if multi-religious collaboration and service towards communities happens, especially when it happens with women and by women, that's when we will not have any war anywhere anymore. Right now, we're talking about secular misogynistic attitudes which make use of religion and religious values, specific religious values, never multi-religious values. But what dominates today is a misogyny that sometimes makes use of religion, specific religions, for its own purposes. And look at the result around us. To be committed to one's faith tradition demands that we are committed to each other irrespective of our faith traditions. And that's the space that we need to arrive at together. And that's the lesson learned from looking at over 75 years of international engagement within the United Nations system and of secular engagement around the world, and hundreds of years of multi-religious existence, but not multi-religious collaboration towards peace. That's the bridge we have to cross together, working together across our faith traditions, inspired by our common humanity and the fact that actually what will be good for you will be good for me, but your annihilation is mine. Therefore, we have a vested interest in working together. What we need is not to see where we differ so much in our faith traditions. What we need is to understand that we're all created by the same. And therefore, whatever you believe, we will work to serve one another. That the other is but part of ourselves, but never another. And the secular policy-making tradition of the last 75 years has taught us that that doesn't work. What we have to do is different. It has to be inspired by our faiths, to serve our faiths collectively. And perhaps it is now time for the women of faith, like yourselves, to continue to steward that kind of collaboration across faiths on all issues of common good around the world. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.